Good evening. I owe the honor of introducing President Mary Robinson tonight to a connection that perhaps most of you are not aware of this. In her earliest years, President Robinson displayed the good sense, vision, and wisdom that characterize her remarkable career today. She enrolled in a school run by my community, the Religious of the Sacred Heart. She tells a story on herself about how she found her way to our school, Mount Anville in Dublin. Sandwiched between two older brothers and two younger brothers, a fact she attributes to her early interest in human rights, by the way. This 10-year-old couldn't wait for her next birthday to follow in the footsteps of her two older brothers who had gone off to a boarding school. One day, as she was climbing a tree in her yard, her grandfather spotted her through the greenery above and, appalled at her unladylike behavior, shouted for her to come down. Mary went up higher. Within minutes, her grandfather stood before Mary's parents with the emphatic declaration that there would be no waiting for her 11th birthday. She was to go to boarding school now. Her classmates knew her well, as they affectionately remembered her days at Mount Anville on the occasion of her 50th birthday. Said one, "Mary did not like being told what to do." And yet another, "She was so good at everything, it used to drive us mad." With that kind of profile, it is no wonder that 700-some people have flocked here tonight to hear her. On a more serious note, there is a poem by President Robinson's friend, poet and scholar Evan Boland, which offers us an insight, I think, into the deeper layers of her character and her unswerving commitment to human rights. It is entitled "The Emigrant Irish." Like oil lamps, we put them out the back of our houses, of our minds. We had lights better then, newer then, and then a time came, this time, and now we need them. Their dread makeshift example. They would have thrived on our necessities. What they survived, we could not even live. By their lights now, it is time to imagine how they stood there, what they stood with, that their possessions may become our power. Cardboard, iron, their hardships parceled in them, patience, fortitude, long suffering in the bruise-colored dusk of the new world, and all the old songs, and nothing to lose. Now it is time to imagine how they stood there, what they stood with, that their possessions may become our power. I cannot help but think that this humble and reverent attitude toward the gifts of those too often considered the outcast, the vulnerable, and the poor is the spirit that has enabled President Robinson to be a bridge builder between rich and impoverished, between governments and corporations and those who are affected by their decisions, between diverse cultures that span our globe. As the first woman president of Ireland, she visited not only the powerful in Dublin, but the people in the inner city and on the islands. And she dressed in appropriate finery for all to signal her respect for each person, no matter the position in life. Her memory of the great famine suffered by her own people impelled her to be the first head of state to visit Somalia and Rwanda after their crises, underlining the imperative that developed nations partner with nations in dire need. She was a people's president. As UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, she embodied the spirit expressed by one of her cherished models, Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, "If human rights are to matter, They must matter in small places close to home. Her charge to integrate human rights concerns in all the activities of the United Nations would be daunting at the least, were it not for her uncommon gift of seeing behind every project and policy the faces of real people in small places close to home. And now, as the founder and director of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative begun in 2002, President Robinson has given birth to yet another vision of hope. EGI has taken as its bold mandate a threefold challenge: to harness civil society, government, business, and economic forums to build awareness for select issues of concern, to facilitate dialogues and relationships between decision makers and key stakeholders, particularly those most marginalized, to arrive at more transparent, ethical, and responsible policies and joint actions to achieve changes, and finally, to develop specific policy recommendations and seek to communicate their findings to key decision makers and to the wider public. Who of us would dare to attempt such a program, but one who, like an oil lamp in the imagery of the Irish emigrant, beams patience, fortitude, long suffering in the bruise-colored dusk of our world, one who has nothing to lose. Tonight, we welcome a valiant woman, described so poignantly in the book of Proverbs. She finds her labor well worthwhile. Her lamp does not go out at night. She holds out her hand to the poor. She opens her arms to the needy. She is clothed in strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. When she opens her mouth, she does so wisely. On her tongue is kindly instruction. Give her a share in what her hands have worked for, and let her works praise her at the city gates. With gratitude, great respect, and genuine esteem, President Robinson, we welcome you at our city gates.
Good evening, President Mary Lyons, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very real pleasure to be here and to make personal contact with the Joan Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. And I must say I really very much appreciated the warm welcome and the very fine words of welcome introducing me here this evening. And it's good to see so many of you and to know that there are others I can't see who are also listening in. And the bonus was you put on the Santa Ana, as I understand it, to greet me. I was afraid when I heard about the developing relations with Ireland, you might try and make me feel at home with a shower or something when I arrived, but happily not. Peace and justice are the cornerstones of a more ethical, of a more values-led globalization. And human rights, I believe, provide the universal language that can make such a difference, as Eleanor Roosevelt has been quoted, in small places close to home. But how can we achieve a world of peace and justice when the reality is that global inequalities divide us so starkly? I wanted to put a human face on some of those inequalities by describing briefly 2 visits that I made recently, visits that were made in order to make human rights relevant to people's lives. Earlier this month, I went to Mozambique. I joined my colleagues from Oxfam there. I serve as honorary president of Oxfam International. And I went to a small village in a part of Mozambique which has very poor land but grows sugarcane very well, Sinn Féin. I went to a local village, and the women there greeted me with song in their local language, Changana. They wore colourful headscarves. There were many young children, some of them babies on their knees. And beyond them, in the shade of trees, I could see the fields of sugarcane, taller than any man. And they finished singing and began to ask me what I was going to do about the terrible difficulties they were having because of the insecure price for the sugar they were producing. They had some access to the market of the European Union, but they had learned that the European Union, because of a WTO case against them, was going to change their sugar management. They changed the system of subsidies, which already had affected the world price. And they were pleading for more time in order to help to develop the sugarcane production and the factory production nearby, which was very competitive. And it was brought home to me that in Mozambique it's possible to produce a very good quality of sugar at a much lower price than, for example, in my native Ireland, where it's sugar produced from sugar beet, as in the rest of Europe. And I was faced with a very real, tangible reality that Europe must recognize that where very poor countries like Mozambique can be competitive, and we're talking also about other countries like Malawi and Zambia and Ethiopia, all what we call least developed countries that could make a better life through being competitive in the product that they can really compete in the world market if they get a fair chance. And a few months earlier, in early December, I was in Mali in West Africa. This time I was looking at the product cotton, and I went again to a village and out into the cotton field, where I saw women, and it was all women, picking the cotton, bending down and picking it. And under the shade, and not quite the shade of a tree, I saw babies lying in a ditch, and toddlers, and then older children minding the toddlers and the babies because the women couldn't afford to send them to school. And what I felt very acutely was, this is a human rights issue. These children don't have food security, they don't have sanitation, they don't go to school, and their mothers are desperately trying to work their way out of this. And this time it was the United States that was the particular focus because of the cotton subsidies to producers here, some to producers that are not well off, but others to very wealthy producers, if I could put it that way, of cotton. And again, it's something we're going to have to look at during this year. And I thought it was a sort of backdrop with a very human face to some of the issues that I want to talk about, because these equalities we face are a terrible indictment of our collective humanity. Indeed, it's inaccurate to say that we face them. The truth is that most of the time we ignore them or are indifferent to them. Yet, these global inequalities should haunt us. I believe that they should shame us, because for the first time in human history, we have the capacity and the resources to eliminate them. What we lack is political will and a sense of connection, a sense of urgency. And I think it's worth bringing home in statistics for a moment how great these global inequalities are. The Human Development Report of 2004 gives some indicators, and I quote, "More than 800 million people suffer from undernourishment. Some 100 million children who should be in school are not, and 60 million of them are girls. More than 1 billion people survive on less than $1 a day. Some 1.8 billion people live in countries where political regimes don't fully accommodate democratic, political and civil freedoms. And about 900 million people belong to ethnic, religious, racial or linguistic groups that face discrimination. The picture that emerges is increasingly one of two very different groups of countries. those that have benefited from development and those that have been left behind. An unprecedented number of countries saw development slide backwards in the 1990s. In 46 countries, people are poorer today than in 1990. In 25 countries, more people go hungry today than a decade ago. And the figure that isn't in that particular extract, but the one that I find most compelling in one sense and most shocking in another, is that UNICEF tell us that 30,000 children die each day from hunger or preventable disease, from the diseases that I've seen, diarrhea, from the lack of a bed net, so the baby gets malaria. Bed nets cost $5 and in fact should be available without cost to families in infected areas. So these are very real issues. While more and more people are conscious of the intolerable burden of debt on the poorest countries, a debt which was often incurred in the past by bad dictators who built fancy palaces or military equipment that wasn't needed and which never benefited the general population. What's less appreciated is that poor countries are currently financing the huge deficit here in the United States and indeed financing deficits in other wealthy countries. The World Bank's report, Global Development Finance, Harnessing Cyclical Gains for Development, puts it this way. Since 2000, the developing world has been a net exporter of capital to the advanced economies, end quote. Larry Summers, under some pressure at the moment as president of Harvard University, writing in Business Times on the 9th of March 2004, explained, and I quote him, "The largest international flow of fixed income debt today takes the form of borrowing by the world's richest nations at probably negative real interest rates from countries with very large numbers of poor." This is one of the global inequities that we need to bear in mind. Not only is more debt relief for the poorest countries essential, but rich countries, such as the United States, should no longer borrow cheaply from poorer ones. Another problem is the unfairness of global governance. This was analysed in the report of the World Commission on the Social Dimensions of Globalization in its report about 18 months ago called Fair Globalization. I'm a member of something called the Helsinki Group on Globalization and Democracy, and we're sort of following up on these reports because we've had a lot of reports and trying to work out how we get more implementation, how we get more action for change. And as a member of the Helsinki Group, I was in Tanzania last fall, when President Mkapa of Tanzania, who was co-chair of the Global Commission, made a passionate plea to us. And I want to take his words because I thought he really spoke from the heart. He said, "I urge you," meaning us members of the Helsinki Group, "I urge you to take up the challenge, to agitate for the political will in all governments to do much more to improve the global governance of globalization and to create opportunities for people within countries and opportunities for countries within the international system to benefit more from globalization." Political and government leaders are beginning to understand that global peace and security cannot be guaranteed without global social and economic justice and success in the war on poverty. The imbalances of power and influence in the process and the inequalities of the benefits of globalization are not only a moral wrong, they are one of the factors fanning the flame of crime nationally and across borders, and probably the ogre of terrorism. In an increasingly integrated world, it is futile for rich countries to believe they can shield themselves away from those negative aspects of globalization. It's in everyone's long-term interest that these aspects are adequately addressed rather than wished away. For global governance to be fair, globalization must be much more inclusive than it is today. Democracy and human rights that are rightly demanded at the national level must be reflected at the global level. Otherwise, most of the developing countries will see calls of more democracy and human rights at the national level as hypocrisy and double standards. Globalization and its governance must be more inclusive politically, it must be more inclusive economically, and it must be more inclusive culturally. It must also be more inclusive in its promotion of human and social security. Another reason for urgency in looking at these problems of global inequalities is that most of the world population increase, which will occur in the next few decades, estimated as adding a further 2 billion people overall, will be in the poorest countries. Already, we have a profile of some of the poorest countries showing that at least half of their population is under 25, with youth unemployment of over 60%. Can we begin to predict the outcomes of a further substantial increase in angry, frustrated young people without real hope for their future? Statistics give us the numbers we account for in addressing inequalities, but they fail to convey the humiliation, the insecurities, the hopelessness, the lack of dignity involved. Listening to a family living in absolute poverty, it's this lack that they speak of. The lack of self-respect, the indignity and humiliation of a refugee camp, the invisibility of being homeless, the helplessness in the face of violence, including violence caused by those in uniform who should protect. I often think of a particular individual whom I met when I was visiting a refugee camp at the time of the terrible conflict in Kosovo that had driven out so many of the population of Kosovo into surrounding countries. I was in the capital of Albania visiting some of these people who were desperate, who had just come from a situation of terrible violence. And I was with some of my human rights colleagues, because I was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights at the time, who were taking some of the stories of violations with a view to subsequent prosecution in the International Tribunal. And then one of them said to me, "Oh, would you like to come round the corner? There's a teacher here who's teaching children." So I said, yes, I'd love to come round and just see what she's doing. And I came round, and there was a young teacher teaching a class of children on grass. I remember that there was a line with some washing drying on it beside them. They had no books, no pencils, nothing, but she was teaching. And she finished the class and came over to me, and she said, "Well, I'm teaching because it'll keep me sane. This is what I do." But she said, "I'd love if you would come and meet my parents." And as we walked to the corner of the refugee camp where her parents were, she told me about being driven from their home literally and seeing their home burnt behind them. And she said, "We were relatively well off. I got university education, I'm a teacher, my family were quite well off, and now we have nothing. And the problem is that my mother is a diabetic, and she can't get to the latrines, which are at the other end of the camp, in time, especially at night." And then I went and met her mother. And again, it's that very human reality for hundreds of thousands, indeed, in many cases for people who are stuck in a situation like that for something like 15 years. And yet, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and carried forward in the body of international law that's been painstakingly developed over half a century, the world has expressed through human rights a legal framework of shared commitment to the values of dignity, equality, and human security for all people. So our challenge, your challenge as well as mine, is to give those values practical effect, both in our own communities and in the global community of nations. We each have a responsibility to help realize the vision of the Universal Declaration. And I think I like to quote two brief articles from the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration, which is actually quite short in itself. Article 1, which proclaimed that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And dignity comes before rights, which I like very much. We don't think about that enough, that it's that self-respect, it's that self-worth that matters so much. And Article 29, we seem to have ignored in the Western world to a very large extent. It says that everyone owes duties to the community, without which you do not gain the full expression of your personality. A remarkable statement, because what it's saying to us is that each of us should recognize that we have duties to the community and do something about it. But I think we also need to think about what we mean by community. It meant one thing in 1948. It probably, for Eleanor Roosevelt, was quite a broad community, but for many people it would have been their local state, their local town, their local community. But now, as we increasingly recognise, we live in a global community. And we do have these important covenants and conventions. I won't go into them now. We can perhaps talk about them a little more in the question and answer session. But they were all addressed in a World Conference in 1993 in Vienna under the banner All Human Rights for All, which was endorsing a very strong link between human rights, democracy, and development. And we began this century, the 21st century, with an important affirmation of that link. In September 2000, in New York, the largest gathering ever of heads of state and government came together for a Millennium General Assembly. And they adopted what's called the Millennium Declaration, in which the international community renewed its commitment to the principles of justice and international law. The Millennium Declaration stressed the need for sustained efforts to create a shared future based upon our common humanity in all its diversity. And it identified a priority which says it all, if we could only do it. This was exactly what the heads of state and government committed to. They said it was their priority, and I quote, to make globalization work for all the world's people. It's simply said, but it isn't happening. The moment was also marked by a spirit of rededication to international law and institutions as the best hope for the 21st century. And the Millennium Development Goals were agreed to with specific targets and timelines as the practical global agenda. These eight goals, and I often stop at this point and say, am I connecting when I talk about the Millennium Development Goals? I feel I am to those who have been involved in the Joan Kroc Institute for Justice and Peace, because these goals are extraordinarily important, but I have found that for wider audiences, on the whole, they're not something that people automatically know about. The 8 goals include halving those in extreme poverty and hunger by 2015, achieving universal primary education for boys and girls by 2015. Now remember what I said earlier, more than 100 million children never go to school, and the majority of them are girls, so it's a big change. And specific targets for promoting gender equality and empowerment of women, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, because more than 500,000 women die annually at childbirth or just before or after childbirth, simply because there was nobody there to help, nobody who knew what to do or no proper sanitation. The goals also include combating HIV and AIDS, malaria and other diseases, ensuring environmental sustainability, and the last goal, Goal 8, includes developing a global partnership for development. And that global partnership was discussed in Monterrey in Mexico in a conference on financing for development. The conference was addressing the problem that is rightly raised. Well, if we want to achieve all these goals, what's it going to cost? And I remember at the time listening to the debate and having the benefit of the report of a group of economists under the chairmanship of Ernesto Zedillo, a former president of Mexico. And the report estimated that the cost of implementing the Millennium Goals and therefore making globalization work for all the world's people would be approximately an additional $50 billion a year, which was at the time roughly doubling the global development budget of all countries, the development aid budget. And I thought it was a very large amount of money, $50 billion. But when you look at other figures, when you look at the fact that the world spends more than $900 billion on armaments, on military equipment, when you look at even agricultural subsidies, which I was talking about earlier, which amount to more than $300 billion a year between mainly the United States, Europe, Japan, other rich countries subsidizing, then $50 billion a year to really make an impact on global inequalities doesn't seem such a great amount of money. And if it would bring about the kind of security that President Kappa was talking about, then it would seem extraordinarily important. But of course, after 1 year after the Millennium Assembly and the Millennium Declaration, we had the terrible attacks in this country and an understandable focus on human security. Our post-9/11 world is preoccupied with different experiences of insecurity. The atrocities in Darfur and Sudan, the misery of millions living with and orphaned by HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia and elsewhere, the long hardships suffered by indigenous peoples in the Americas, the humiliating poverty in slums and rural areas in the developing world, they all tell us a deplorable truth, that governments in different regions of the world are failing to provide even the rudiments of human security. There's no doubt that since those terrible attacks in this country and other attacks such as in Spain and in Bali and in parts of Africa, the focus is on state security and combating acts of terrorism. But the stark reality is that the terrible attacks of 9/11 didn't have any discernible impact on the millions of people already at daily risk from violence, disease, and abject poverty. Their insecurity continues to stem from worry about where the next meal will come from, how to acquire medicines for a dying child, how to avoid the criminal with a gun, how to manage the household as a 10-year-old AIDS orphan, the comprehensive insecurity of the powerless. For women, gender is itself a risk factor threatening human security. The secret violence of household abuse, the private oppressions of lack of property or inheritance rights, the lifelong deprivations that go with lack of schooling, and the structural problems of political exclusion. Women are particularly vulnerable in zones of conflict and in post-conflict situations. And it is good that we are at last recognizing the important role that women can play as actors for change, as those who can make a real difference. There was an important report, an independent commission on human security, co-chaired by Amartya Sen and Sadaka Ogata, which compiled a report called Human Security Now, which was published in 2003. And this explains that human security involves a new paradigm which shifts from an overemphasis on security of the state to security of the people, to human security. And the emphasis is on the extent to which human security brings together the human elements of security, of rights, and of development. The report identifies two underlying concepts, protection and empowerment, which lie at the heart of human security. The first of these, protection, is primarily a state responsibility, and it's a very real responsibility. And sometimes it can be an international responsibility, as has been made clear by the high-level panel that reported recently to Secretary General Kofi Annan, and which emphasized the importance of a responsibility to protect, including at the international level. I think that the outline that I've given has really brought home that we need to focus on the human elements of security as a way of addressing the imbalances and the inequities in our world of today. Secretary General Kofi Annan put it this way: human security in its broadest sense embraces far more than the absence of violent conflict. It encompasses human rights, good governance, access to education and healthcare, and ensuring that each individual has opportunities and choices to fulfill his or her potential. And I believe that linking in this way human security with development can have a positive impact on the allocation of resources. The project that I lead in New York, Realising Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative, is seeking to extend a human rights analysis and a strong gender perspective into issues of trade and development by looking at agricultural subsidies, as I explained, into health issues, particularly the pandemic of HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, and into migration. I serve on the Global Commission on International Migration, which will be having hearings in Mexico City in May for the Americas to look at issues of migration in this region. We've already had hearings in Asia that were held in Manila in the Philippines. We had hearings for the North Africa in Cairo that looked at both sides of the Mediterranean. We had hearings in Budapest for Europe, and we had hearings most recently in Cape Town for the southern African region. And it was interesting that many of the problems were similar. The problems of undocumented migrants, the problems of trafficking, the problems of the poverty driving a labour mobility which, if it could not travel legally, would fall into the hands of gangs who would smuggle people, and in some cases, particularly those trying to get to Europe, those trying to cross the border south of here, sometimes at risk of their lives. What we will try to do in the Global Commission on International Migration is have an approach that manages migration with a more human face, with a more human and humane dimension, by recognizing that all migrants do have human rights. So let me now come to the most important challenge that we face. Given the kind of global inequalities, how can we mobilize to address them? How can we make a difference? I believe that this year, 2005, gives us a unique opportunity to begin a serious process of making a change that matters. And in a curious way, the year began, or just before the year began, we had a terrible tragedy and catastrophe which caused an enormously positive human response. I'm talking, of course, about the Asian tsunami. I'm honorary president of Oxfam International, as I mentioned, and Oxfam was overwhelmed by the response of individuals. The money pouring in. Indeed, at one point, Oxfam had to say, look, don't give us any more money for the tsunami. We now can cope. We have more than we can deal with over the coming years. And remember the other areas like Darfur that need more support. I understand that some 30% of households in this country gave something, made some personal gesture towards the relief for the victims of the tsunami and for the rebuilding of their lives and their communities. So people are ready to respond. And during 2005, there are three very significant occasions when, at a political level, a change can be made. And something else has happened. The various groups that have been working on issues of poverty, like making poverty history in the Britain and Ireland and parts of Europe, the One campaign here in this country, and other campaigns in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, they've come together in what's called the Global Call for Action on Poverty, or it's called GCAP. And it was launched at the World Social Forum in January of this year in Porto Alegre. And it was also endorsed in the other forum, the World Economic Forum, where I was present at the launch, presided over by Kumi Naidoo, who is a South African who's head of Civicus, which is a large grouping of civil society groups. And it also had my fellow Irish person, very famous person, Bono, whom I gather was here in San Diego not very long ago. And indeed, Gordon Brown, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was also present. And we were welcoming the establishment of this global call for action against poverty. There was a senior representative of the trade union movement, a woman, I'm glad to say, Sharon Burrow, who's the first president of one of the major European trade unions. And the idea is that on 3 occasions this year, those who support this global call for action on poverty will wear a white band. It's a very simple symbol of the 4 objectives of the global call for action against poverty. They are calls for fair trade, the issue that I began with in talking about Mali and Mozambique, cancellation of debt for the poorest countries because it's crippling their capacity to develop their education and health systems and so on, the fulfillment of the commitment to more development aid in order to help fulfill the Millennium Goals, and the fulfillment by all countries of their commitments under the Millennium Development Goals, which includes good governance commitments for developing countries. These are the 4 objectives. And the mobilization will take place on the 3 occasions when there is an opportunity for real political will to be exercised. The first of these occasions is the G8 meeting in Britain. It'll actually take place in Gleneagles in Scotland in early July. So on the 1st of July, there will be a global call for action against poverty, a GCAP day of wearing the white band. The second day will be on the 10th of September, when the high-level special meeting of the General Assembly is due to meet during the following week to talk about taking stock of the Millennium Development Goals after the first 5 years, with a view to saying we've only 10 years left before 2015, how are we going to really ensure implementation? Because the analysis at the moment is that there is a falling behind on most of the goals, and that African countries have no hope of achieving any of the goals unless circumstances change. No hope of achieving any of the goals until about 2050, not 2015. So there is an urgent need to change that. The third date is the ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization, which will take place in Hong Kong in December. And I think the third date for the mobilization with the white band of millions of ordinary people urging more commitment will take place on, I think, the 10th of December. And I'm saying this because it's an opportunity, particularly perhaps for some of the those who have been involved with the Joan Kroc Institute for Justice and Peace, to inform themselves and perhaps to build up some support here in San Diego. It seems to me to reflect the kind of generosity of spirit that was evident in the response to the tsunami. And it's something that people can do. I'm often asked, what can I do? Yes, you can buy fair trade coffee and other products. Yes, you can inform yourself and be aware of companies that have bad practices, that use child labour or exploitative conditions, and not buy their products. You can be an informed consumer. You can be involved in good causes locally and internationally, supporting Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, etc. But now I think you can be part, hopefully, of a desire to have a fairer globalization. And we've talked about it long enough, we've had enough reports. I think it's time now that people walked out into the street on certain days and wore a symbol to say, this globalization is unfair, we have to do something about it. And as well as needing a fairer globalization, we also need to reinforce that commitment to human rights as part of our birthright. So let me conclude by highlighting the emphasis placed by Shirin Ebadi of Iran, the 2003 Nobel Peace Prize winner, on the universality of human rights. I was actually in Tehran a couple of years ago when I was High Commissioner, and I went to her university and saw the wonderful course that she was teaching her students, and that there were as many, indeed I think marginally more, girl students than boy students, and they asked me wonderful questions, and their English was remarkable as well. So I was delighted when she got the Nobel Peace Prize. And in her contribution to the Human Development Report 2004, she begins by identifying the differences in people that are part of cultural diversity, and she emphasizes the importance of cultural diversity. But she then emphasizes that human rights embody the fundamental values of human civilizations, and she concludes, so cultural relativity should never be used as a pretext to violate human rights, since these rights embody the most fundamental values of human civilizations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is needed universally. applicable to both East and West. It is compatible with every faith and religion. Failing to respect our human rights only undermines our humanity. Let us not destroy this fundamental truth. If we do, the weak will have nowhere to turn. That's a wonderful way of affirming the importance of human rights. And now I look forward to hearing your views on all of this. And thank you for being such a good audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that amazing speech. Our theme, actually, this year has been human rights under pressure. I think that what you are referring to is, in fact, quite applicable to the fact that we're not meeting our goals. But I think in just launching this, I would like to ask you, there was a development today which I'm not sure if you had a chance to see because you've been traveling most of the day. But today in the United Nations, the U.S. agreed to allow the International Criminal Court to hear the case of Darfur instead of the United States, which has not supported the International Criminal Court, had been arguing that the situation in Darfur was a genocide, and yet it would not permit the case to go to the International Criminal Court because it doesn't support it. And so it had asked that a new court be created, which would be incredibly expensive, very time-consuming, and very inefficient. And today, in fact, at the UN, the U.S. has agreed to allow the case to go to the International Criminal Court. And when we speak of a global community for human rights, I'm wondering how you see the U.S. role in this.
Well, in fact, I had heard that what I regard as really very good news, because the situation in Darfur is actually worse than we think. I get quite a lot of feedback from Save the Children on the ground there, from my colleagues in Oxfam, from UN colleagues, and it really has been a terrible shame on us all that we were not more effective. We said after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, never again. We said after Rwanda, never again, after Kosovo, and yet the world has been very slow to react. The difference now is that we do have this International Criminal Court. I was High Commissioner when the statute of the court was agreed in Rome. I was there, and I said very publicly that, in my opinion, it was one of the most important advances for humankind, because it means that terrible tyrants and despots, they can run, but they cannot hide now. We have a place that they can be brought to, and they know it. It's already beginning to have an effect internationally, and it is a step that will make a big difference on the ground in Darfur. I have no doubt about it, and we must do something that is really effective. So what I would hope is that this step of allowing the issue to be referred to the International Criminal Court will cause a kind of reopening and rethinking of the possibilities of the United States accepting and ratifying the statute of the court. I know that there are concerns, but I believe those concerns can be addressed. And there's another instrument that I would love the United States to look at again, and there's a reason why they might. I was in Cape Town earlier this month at a World Congress on the family and children's rights. It was the 4th such World Congress, and it was marking the 15th anniversary of the most ratified human rights instrument, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it was noted, as I think a number of you do know, that the only 2 countries that haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child are Somalia, which has actually signed now and probably will ratify when it gets a government together for long enough to do that, and the United States. And 192 countries have ratified it. And what we were hearing at this conference was democracy for children. We were hearing that countries send their reports to the Committee on the Rights of the Child in Geneva of how they are progressively implementing rights of children in their country, that the committee has looked at more than 250 of these reports, has issued general comments of jurisprudence about children's identity, about children with disabilities, about refugee children and so on, and how important that is. And the constitutional barrier, as I have understood it, which until recently was invoked as a reason why the United States has not ratified, was that the convention prohibited applying capital punishment to those who committed the crime while under 18, while juveniles. But as you will have noted, the Supreme Court in this country has recently found unconstitutional that provision. So that seems to open up a real possibility. So rather than go through all the issues I might possibly go through, I would say now is the time perhaps for the United States to re-look at some of these conventions. The First Lady, Barbara Bush, was in Afghanistan the other day supporting the situation of women and girls, and I was in Afghanistan myself, and I know how important that is. But for women and girls in Afghanistan, the important instrument is the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which 179 countries have now ratified, and the United States is the only large industrialized country which has not ratified. So there's a sort of disconnect between supporting the rights of women and not being a paid-up member of the convention with its committee, with its whole apparatus that the United States could give leadership in, which I'm sure if Eleanor Roosevelt was around, she'd be knocking at the door about it. Yes.
She would. Thank you. I cannot speak for other members of the audience, but I think many of us are probably not as aware as we should be of all the treaties and conventions to which the U.S. is or is not a signatory, and part of it is we need to be better educated and we need to be better advocates. Sorry, that's my soapbox. Could you tell us, what are the questions we have? Could you tell us about some countries which are outstanding in striving to fulfill the Millennium Development Goals?
That's a good question. The truth is that developing countries are taking the agenda of the Millennium Goals really very seriously. I can think of Ghana, for example, is doing outstanding work, but so is Tanzania, President Kapa's country. They are hoping that this shared global agenda, which the UN and all its agencies has adopted as their priority, which the World Bank has adopted, which donor governments, you will have seen the recent report of Prime Minister Tony Blair's Commission on Africa, and that commission recognises the progress that is being made, including progress in governance in a number of African countries. Some of the poorer Asian countries are very committed to the Millennium Goals. And I think what is worrying is that until now, the fact that we have this global prioritising agenda is not sufficiently known. And that was why there was a major project recently directed by Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia, who's a good friend. He's actually on the board of the project Realising Rights that I promote. He had a major project called the Millennium Project, with about 250 leading academics on issues like hunger, education, HIV and AIDS, maternal mortality, child mortality, environmental issues. And those task forces reported on how to support those developing countries that are making progress. And in fact, countries like China and India have made an awful lot of progress on the first goal of bringing a lot of their population out of poverty. But it's mainly African and some South Asian countries that have huge problems there.
Thank you. Following up on the Millennium, the countries that are doing well, there's a question about how Ireland is doing with meeting the Millennium Goals.
That's a fair question. I should have to answer for Ireland as well. In actual fact, Ireland made a commitment that I was extremely proud of at the Millennium Assembly in September 2000. It made a commitment to reach the target of 0.7% of GDP in development aid by 2007. It was 0.7% by 0.7. Unfortunately, there's been a bit of slippage, and I had to be a little bit critical of the government back home, and a lot of very good idealistic young people joined in criticising, but the commitment is there. It's a question of what particular year it will be arrived at. There are 5 countries that already meet that target, and 6, including France, United Kingdom, Ireland, that have made a commitment. In contrast, the United States has a very low level of official development aid. Individual people from the United States are very generous, and the United States does a lot in peacekeeping. But I think the figure is, instead of being 0.7%, it's 0.14%, I think, which is certainly the lowest of any industrialized country. The commitment made by President Bush at Monterey, which is going into the Millennium Challenge account, is making a difference. That's a bigger commitment. But as far as I know, despite the fact that the Millennium Challenge account has been established, no money has yet been dispensed out of that account to any developing countries. So, but anyway, I was being asked about Ireland, and I go back to the United States. It's terrible. But I think when I was President of Ireland, I made a lot of links between Ireland and developing countries. And I think I should tell you, actually, a story that I used a lot to try to get young Irish people to think of connections with developing countries, because it's a connection between this country and Ireland that will be one that may surprise some of you. Ireland suffered a terrible famine when the potato crop failed in 1845, and the potato was the staple crop of the poorest Irish. They used other crops to pay rent, and there was a terrible problem of cruel landlords, etc. The potato crop failed again in 1846, and then when it failed in the third year, those who were stronger had left and come on what we called coffin ships to this country, or to Canada, or to Australia, and people were dying in their hundreds of thousands. About 2 million ultimately died. But in the spring of 1847 in Oklahoma, there was a meeting of the Choctaw people to mark 10 years since they'd been driven from their tribal lands and come through what they call the Vale of Tears. And they learned, we don't quite know how, we think it might have been a passing priest who mentioned that there were people starving on an island far away because their staple crop had failed. And that was completely understandable to the Choctaw people. So they raised $173 and sent it for the relief of Irish famine victims. And we know that because the Victorians are very good bookkeepers. So they kept a very good record of how it was spent, etc. And with stories like that, I think it's fair to say that Irish people are very connected with development issues and do know all about the Millennium Development Goals and are committed to try to fulfill our history. Ireland is prosperous now, it's more or less peaceful, there's been great strides in peace in Northern Ireland, and it's payback time, if you like. It's time to reconnect with other countries who need our support as we needed the support of this country and others in our worst times.